The bullet came from nowhere. One moment, the restaurant was filled with the soft clink of crystal glasses, the murmur of carefully chosen words, the kind of quiet that only existed when powerful men decided it should. The next moment, the air split open, a sharp crack that silenced everything, that turned the warm amber light of the dining room into something cold and terrible, and Elena Vasquez did the only thing her body knew how to do. She moved, she didn't think, she didn't calculate. She stepped directly in front of the man she had been serving dinner to for the past 40 minutes, the man who had not once looked at her as though she were a person, and she spread her arms wide, and the bullet that had been aimed at his chest passed so close to her left ear that she felt the heat of it, like a whispered threat, like a promise of something that had almost happened. The glass behind her shattered. Silence, not the comfortable silence of before. This was a different animal entirely, the kind of silence that had weight, that pressed down on every person in that room, that made the air feel thick and unbreathable. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. Not the men in black suits stationed at every corner. Not the other diners, who had frozen in positions so still they looked like photographs of themselves. Not the man she had just shielded, the man whose dark eyes were now fixed on her with an expression that was impossible to read, because men like him had spent decades making sure their expressions were impossible to read. His name was Damien Carr, and he was staring at her like she had done something that had never happened to him before in his entire life. Elena lowered her arms slowly. Her hands were shaking. She could feel them trembling at her sides, but she kept her chin level and her gaze steady, because whatever happened next, she refused to let him see her break. The ringing in her ear was fading. The chaos was beginning. She could hear men shouting at the far end of the restaurant, the crash of a table being overturned, footsteps pounding, but all of that felt very far away. What felt close was this, the 6 inches of charged air between her body and his, and the way Damien Carr had not moved a single muscle since the moment she had stepped in front of him. One of his men reached her first, grabbing her arm with a grip that would leave bruises. "Don't touch her." The voice was quiet. Absolutely, terrifyingly quiet. The kind of quiet that contained multitudes, that carried the weight of consequences the mind didn't want to imagine. The hand released her arm instantly. Elena turned her head and looked at Damien Carr, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it, something moved behind his eyes. Not gratitude, not warmth, something rawer than that, something that looked almost like shock, then it was gone. His face closed like a door. "Get her out of the room," he said, and looked away from her, and Elena felt the strange, hollow sensation of being dismissed after having possibly just saved a man's life. She was escorted to a back office by 2 men who moved like shadows and spoke like walls. The office was small and cold and smelled of old paper and leather. She was told to sit. She sat. She was not told anything else, and so she waited. And while she waited, she pressed her hands flat against her thighs and stared at the far wall and breathed, in and out, slow and deliberate. Way her mother had taught her to breathe when the world became too loud to bear. She had worked at Maison Carré for 11 months. She had known from the first week exactly what kind of establishment it was, had understood it in the way you understood certain things without being told, the way you read a room by the quality of its silence, by the way the staff never made eye contact with certain guests, by the fact that the wine list was printed on paper, so thick it felt like a statement of intent. She had known, and she had stayed anyway, because the money was good, and the shifts were manageable, and she had a very specific reason for needing both of those things to be true at the same time. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she was 28 years old, and she had been a waitress at Maison Carré for 11 months, and she had just stepped in front of a bullet meant for a man who, by every reliable account she had quietly collected, was one of the most dangerous people in the city. She had not done it because she was brave. She had not done it because she had a death wish. She had done it because in the half-second between hearing the crack of the gun and understanding what it meant, her body had made a decision that her mind was still catching up with, and somewhere in that half-second, She had seen the face of someone else entirely, someone she had lost, someone whose absence sat in her chest like a stone she had learned to breathe around. But she didn't think about that now. Now she sat in the cold office and waited, and the minutes stretched out long and strange around her. Damien Carr did not go to the back office for 27 minutes. She knew because she had counted. She had nothing else to do, and counting gave her something to hold on to, a rhythm, a structure, a small proof that time was still moving even when everything else felt suspended. When the door finally opened, he came in alone. No men behind him, no shadows flanking him. Just him and the particular quality of his presence, which was something Elena had noticed from her very first shift serving his table. He was tall, but it wasn't his height that made a room feel smaller when he entered it. It was something less tangible than that. Something in the way he moved, as though the space around him belonged to him by right, as though the air itself had agreed to make way. He was wearing a dark suit that probably cost more than 3 of her monthly paychecks, and there was a small cut on his jaw from a shard of glass, and he had not bothered to address it. He sat down across from her, rested his forearms on the table, and looked at her in silence for a long moment. She met his gaze and held it. He was the kind of handsome that was almost aggressive, sharp angles, dark eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been designed to carry the weight of serious thoughts. There was nothing soft about his face, nothing that invited approach. He looked like a man who had decided, at some point in his youth, that softness was a liability he could not afford, and had excised it so thoroughly that he had forgotten it was ever there. "You stepped in front of me," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't gratitude. It was a statement delivered with the same flat precision he probably used to deliver business decisions, a fact being catalogued, a variable being assessed. "Yes," Elena said. "Why?" No inflection on the word. No rise at the end to indicate it was a question. Just the word, dropped into the space between them like a stone into still water. Elena held his gaze and took a breath. "I don't know," she said. "It happened before I could think about it." Something moved in his expression. Not much, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional shift in the quality of his attention. "That," he said quietly, "is either the most honest answer anyone has ever given me, or the most carefully constructed one." "It's the honest one," she said. He looked at her for another long moment, then he said, "You understand what this restaurant is?" It wasn't a question either. "Yes," she said again. "And you've worked here for," he paused, just slightly, which meant he already knew and was choosing to pause for a reason she didn't yet understand. 11 months, yes, and in 11 months, he said, "you have never once looked at me with fear." The air between them changed. Elena felt it, a shift in pressure, like the moment before a storm when the temperature drops by 2 degrees and the birds go quiet. She kept her expression steady and said nothing, because she understood on some instinctive level that silence was the right answer here. Damien Carr leaned back in his chair very slightly and studied her. "Most people," he said, "look at me with fear. The ones who don't look at me with ambition. There is rarely a third category." "And which category am I?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. He let the silence sit, the way men like him use silence as a tool, a pressure, a test. And then he said, so quietly she almost didn't catch it, "I haven't decided yet." He stood. He straightened his jacket with one precise gesture. He moved toward the door. "You will not return to the dining floor tonight," he said without turning around. "You will be compensated for the full shift. Someone will arrange a car to take you home." A pause, brief and weighted, and Miss Vasquez, she looked up at the back of his head, "Do not speak about what happened in that room to anyone." Left, the door closed behind him with a soft, final click that somehow carried more authority than a slam ever could. Elena sat in the silence he'd left behind and pressed her hands flat against her thighs again and breathed. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her apartment, small and warm and carefully arranged, every object in it chosen with the kind of deliberate intentionality of someone who had once had very little and was quietly determined never to feel that way again. And she stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment on a loop. Not the bullet, not the shattering, glass, not even the look in his eyes afterward, though that came back to her more than once, persistent as a song she couldn't shake. What she kept returning to was the feeling in her chest right now. Not fear. Fear she knew well, she was intimately acquainted with it, had learned its texture and its weight and the specific way it settled into the body when it moved in to stay. This wasn't fear. This was something else. Something more unsettling in its way, because fear, at least, she knew how to manage. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and stared at the ceiling and told herself it was adrenaline, it was shock. It was the perfectly reasonable physiological response of a human body that had nearly been shot. She told herself that several times. She almost believed it. She was back at work the following evening. No one said anything about the night before. The dining room had been restored to its immaculate state, every broken glass replaced, every overturned chair set right, every trace of violence scrubbed away with the same thoroughness that wealthy men applied to all inconvenient truths. The staff moved around her with careful normalcy, the kind that telegraphed awareness of something unspoken, and Alina moved through her shift with her chin level and her expression composed and her hands mercifully steady. He arrived at 8:30. She felt the shift in the room before she saw him, that particular reconfiguration of attention, like iron filings responding to a magnet, that happened whenever Damien Carr entered a space. She was setting a table near the window when he came in, and she did not look up immediately. She finished setting the table with exactly the care and attention it deserved, and only then did she straighten and turn. He was already looking at her. He stood in the entrance of the dining room with two of his men behind him and the maitre d' speaking quietly at his elbow, and his eyes were on Alina across the length of the restaurant, and the expression on his face was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not acknowledgement, not recognition, not the residue of everything that had passed between them the previous night. Just that flat, measuring gaze that she was beginning to understand was not coldness. Exactly, it was something more calculated than coldness. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then she looked away and walked toward the kitchen, and she told herself the slight acceleration of her heartbeat was simply the result of walking quickly. She was assigned his table. Of course she was. She carried the menu to his table the way she carried everything, with steadiness, with quiet professionalism, with the particular dignity of someone who had decided long ago that no circumstance would reduce her to less than herself. She set it before him without flourish. She did not perform. She did not smile the way the other servers smiled at his table. That stretched, effortful expression that was really just fear wearing a pleasant mask. "Good evening," she said. He did not look up from the menu immediately. He let a beat pass 1, 2, and then he raised his eyes to hers. And something in the quality of his gaze was different tonight. More deliberate, as though last night had recalibrated something in the way he looked at her, and he was still deciding what to do with the recalibration. "Miss Vasquez," he said, just her name, nothing else. But the way he said it measured, unhurried, as though the syllables were being weighed for something other than their dictionary meaning, made the fine hairs on her forearms rise beneath her sleeve. "Will you be having your usual this evening, Mr. Carr?" she asked. A pause, fractional, but she caught it. "Yes," he said, and then, before she could turn away, sit down, she stilled. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet orchestration, the clink of glass, the murmur of polite conversation, the soft movement of staff navigating the space with practiced invisibility. None of it had anything to do with what was happening at this particular table, in this particular pocket of charged air, where a man who did not explain himself had just issued a command that made no conventional sense. "I'm working, Mr. Carr," she said. "I'm aware." His eyes hadn't moved from her face. "Sit down." She should have refused. There were a dozen reasonable, professional grounds on which to refuse, and she was aware of all of them, and she sat down anyway, not because she was afraid to refuse him, but because something in her was unwilling to back down from whatever this was. She settled into the chair across from him, with her hands folded on the table, and her expression entirely composed, and she waited. He studied her for a moment, then he said, "You grew up without money." It wasn't a question. Alina felt the words land with the particular sting of something accurate arriving unexpectedly. "Is that relevant?" she asked. "It explains something," he said. The way you carry yourself. Most people who work in a place like this either come from money and are performing simplicity, or come from nothing and are performing adequacy. He paused. You're not performing anything. She looked at him steadily. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. Then I'll treat it as one. Something happened in his face so brief, so contained that she would have missed it if she hadn't been watching him with the kind of attention you give to something that might move unexpectedly. The corner of his mouth, just the corner, just a fraction, shifted. It wasn't a smile. Damien Carr did not smile. But it was the ghost of something that lived in the same country as amusement. And it came and went so fast that Alina felt obscurely that she had witnessed something she had not been meant to see. My mother was a waitress, she said, and she wasn't sure why she said it. It arrived unbidden, offered up by some instinct she didn't fully understand. He looked at her. She worked 3 jobs for 12 years. Alina continued, her voice even, her eyes on his. She never complained. She never performed adequacy. She was just present in whatever she did, fully present. She paused. I learned everything from watching her. The silence that followed was different from his earlier silences, less like a weapon being held, more like something being considered. He looked at her with that unreadable expression, and then he said, very quietly, Where is she now? Alina met his gaze. She died, she said, 4 years ago. The words were simple, flat. She had learned to say them that way, had spent 4 years sanding them down, until they came out without the jagged edges that could cut her open in public. They still cut, they just did it quietly now, on the inside where no one could see. Something moved through Damien Carr's expression. Not pity, she would have resented pity, and some part of her suspected he knew that. It was something more careful than pity, something that looked, for just a moment, like recognition. Then his phone vibrated on the table and he glanced at it, and his face closed again, sealed shut, every door locked, every window shuttered, and he was once again the man who did not explain himself and did not feel, and had never, as far as anyone could tell, needed anyone in his life. You may return to work, Miss Vasquez, he said. She stood, she smoothed the front of her uniform. She looked at him for exactly 1 moment, just long enough to let him know that she was leaving because she chose to, not because she was dismissed, and she walked away from his table. She did not look back, but she felt his gaze on the back of her neck for the rest of the evening, steady and unrelenting, like a hand pressed flat against a closed door. 3 weeks passed. He came in every Thursday and every Sunday without exception, and on each of those evenings, Alina served his table, and each time something shifted incrementally, a word more exchanged, a silence more loaded, a look that lasted a half second longer than it had the time before. It had the quality of something building, not rushing, not forcing, but accumulating with the patient inevitability of weather. She learned things about him, the way you learned things about people who revealed nothing obliquely, through absence as much as presence. She learned that he took his coffee without sugar and his whiskey with 1 ice cube, and that he always read the dessert menu, even though he never ordered dessert. She learned that the men around him feared him with a specific quality of fear, not the wild, unpredictable fear of someone dangerous because they were unstable, but the clean, cold fear of someone dangerous because they were absolutely certain. She learned that on Sunday evenings he always arrived exactly 12 minutes later than on Thursdays, and she learned this because she noticed, and she did not fully want to examine why she was noticing. She also learned, through the carefully muted conversations of the kitchen staff and the occasional clipped phone call she overheard while clearing adjacent tables, that the man who had fired the shot 3 weeks ago had not been found, which meant he was still out there, which meant that the bullet that had passed so close to her left ear had not been the end of something. It had been the beginning. The confrontation happened on a Sunday. It had been building, she realized afterward, had been coiled beneath the surface of every exchange they'd had, every loaded silence, every look that said more than the words surrounding it. She simply hadn't seen it coming, because she'd been too focused on managing her own reactions to properly read the room. He arrived late, later than his usual Sunday 12-minute variance, almost 40 minutes past his ordinary time, and when he came in, something was different. Not in the way he moved, that was the same controlled precision, the same absolute ownership of whatever space he occupied. It was something in his face, a tightness that hadn't been there before, a temperature behind his eyes. He sat, she came to the table. "You weren't here last Thursday," he said, before she'd greeted him. Before she'd offered the menu, Elena looked at him. "I had a personal matter," she said. "What kind of personal matter?" She held his gaze. "A personal one." The silence that followed was short and compressed, and entirely unlike the deliberate silences he usually deployed. This one felt less controlled, as though it had arrived without his full permission, as though something underneath the surface of his composure was pressing upward, and he was applying pressure. "Keep it down, I need to know," he said, his voice careful and level, "when you will not be here." She tilted her head very slightly. "Why?" Another compressed silence. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Because arrangements need to be made," he said. "Security arrangements. Your absence last Thursday created a..." He stopped. She watched him stop. He was not a man who stopped mid-sentence. She had the sudden and unsettling understanding that he had been about to say something he hadn't planned to say, and had caught it at the last possible moment. "Created a what?" she asked quietly. "A gap," he said, "in the arrangements." It was not what he had been about to say. They both knew it. She let the knowledge sit between them like a third person at the table, present, undeniable, and impossible to comfortably address. "Mr. Carr," she said, keeping her voice even, "I'm a waitress. I'm not part of your security arrangements." Something shifted in his expression. Hard and sudden. "You made yourself part of them," he said, "when you stepped in front of a bullet that was meant for me." The words hit with more force than she'd expected. She felt them in her sternum, a physical impact, like a door flung open onto something she'd been trying to keep closed. She stood very still and held his gaze and said nothing. "Why were you absent?" he asked again, quieter now. Less like a command and more like something that cost him something to ask. Elena looked at him for a long moment. The restaurant moved around them, soft and oblivious and entirely irrelevant. "The anniversary of my mother's death was Thursday," she said. "I take that day every year. I go to the cemetery in the morning, and I spend the rest of the day with her things. She paused. "It's the one day I allow myself to fall apart, and then I put myself back together, and then I come back." The silence that followed this was the longest they had yet shared. Damien Carr looked at her. He looked at her with an expression that had, for just a moment, entirely abandoned its usual architecture, the cold precision, the careful remove, and what was underneath was something raw and undefended that she did not have a name for, because it was not an expression she had expected to find on the face of a man like him. He opened his mouth, he closed it. He looked away. When he looked back, the expression was gone, sealed over, lacquered shut, as though it had never been there. "I see," he said, 2 words, flat and contained. "Is there anything else you need to know about my schedule?" she asked, and the question was gentle and not mocking, not challenging. "Genuine, no," he said. She nodded. She reached for her notepad. "Can I take your order?" And he told her his order in the same measured, controlled voice he always used, and she wrote it down with the same calm professionalism she always brought. And neither of them acknowledged what had just happened between them, the thing that had cracked open and been glimpsed and hurriedly closed again. But it had happened, and they both knew it had happened, and that knowledge, quiet and irreversible, settled into the space between them like a foundation being laid. It was 2 days later that she found the envelope. It was on her doorstep when she arrived home after the Tuesday evening shift. A plain white envelope with her name written on it in handwriting she didn't recognize. She stood in the doorway of her building and looked at it for a long moment before she picked it up. She carried it upstairs. She sat at her kitchen table under the warm light and turned it over in her hands twice before she opened it. Inside was a single card, thick paper, no letterhead, 5 words in that same unfamiliar handwriting. "They know where you live. Alina set the card down on the table with careful, deliberate precision. She pressed her fingertips flat against the tabletop. She breathed, in and out, slow and measured. And then she picked up her phone and stared at the screen for a very long time, and thought about what she was about to do, and whether it was the kind of decision she could take back. She couldn't. She dialed. The phone rang twice. Miss Vasquez. His voice was exactly the same at 11 o'clock at night, as it was across the white tablecloths of his restaurant, controlled, contained without inflection. "Someone left a note on my doorstep," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "It says they know where I live." A silence, different from all his other silences, compressed and tight, and with something moving very fast underneath it. "Don't open your door for anyone," he said. "Don't turn on the lights. I'll have someone there in 8 minutes. Mr. Carr, 8 minutes, Miss Vasquez." The line went dead. She sat in the dark of her kitchen, with the card on the table in front of her, and the sound of the city outside her window, and her hands pressed flat against her thighs, and she counted. It took 7 minutes and 40 seconds. They moved her that same night. She was allowed to pack 1 bag. One of Damien's men, tall, silent, with the kind of face that had been trained out of expressiveness, stood in the doorway of her bedroom while she moved through it, pulling clothes from drawers. With hands that she kept deliberately steady, she did not rush. She did not allow herself to rush, because rushing would mean acknowledging the fear, and the fear was something she was not prepared to give floor space to tonight. She took her clothes. She took her mother's photograph, the one that lived on her nightstand, and the one she looked at every morning before she got up to face the day. She took the small blue notebook she wrote in when the world became too heavy for silence to hold. She zipped the bag. She turned around. The man in the doorway was watching her with the careful blankness of someone who had been trained to observe without reacting. "I'm ready," she said. He nodded once and stepped back, and she followed him out of the apartment she had spent 11 months making into something that felt like hers, and did not allow herself to look back at it. Because looking back was a luxury she could not afford tonight. The car that waited outside was black and unremarkable and clearly armored. She could tell by the weight of the door when it closed behind her, the particular solid sound it made, like the closing of a vault. She sat in the back seat. The city moved past the tinted windows in streaks of amber and white. She held her bag on her lap with both hands and stared straight ahead and told herself she was fine. She was not fine, she was contained. There was a difference, and she knew it, and she sat with it the way she sat with most uncomfortable truths, directly, without flinching, without pretending it was something other than what it was. The safe house was not what she expected. She had constructed an image in the 40-minute drive, something spare and functional, a place designed for utility rather than habitation. What she arrived at instead was an apartment on the 14th floor of a building in the quieter part of the city, and it was furnished with the kind of restrained, expensive taste that suggested it had been someone's actual residence at some point. Dark wood floors, bookshelves that held real books, windows that looked out over the city like a painting hung in exactly the right light. She was shown to a room. She was told that someone would bring food. She was told not to use the landline for personal calls. She was not told when any of this would end. She sat on the edge of the bed in the unfamiliar room with its unfamiliar smell, clean linen, and a faint trace of cedar, and she put her face in her hands and allowed herself exactly 60 seconds of something that wasn't quite crying but lived next door to it. 60 seconds. She had learned to ration herself this way, to give the difficult feelings their allotted time and then close the door on them firmly, because an open door invited everything in, and everything was more than she could currently manage. 60 seconds. Then she lifted her head, breathed, stood up, began to unpack her single bag with the same careful deliberateness she brought to everything. She had just placed her mother's photograph on the bedside table when she heard the front door of the apartment open. She went still, footsteps, 1 pair, unhurried and precise. She recognized the quality of them before she consciously registered why that particular cadence, that economy of movement that said the person walking did not waste anything. Not even mechanics of stepping from one place to another. She came out of the bedroom and into the main room, and Damien Carr was standing in the middle of it, still in his coat, his eyes moving through the space with the rapid efficiency of someone conducting an assessment. They landed on her. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something that moved quickly across his face and then settled into a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Less controlled, more like something had been held very tightly and then, upon seeing her standing there unharmed, had been released. "You came yourself," she said. "Yes." He said it as though it required no explanation, though both of them understood that it required considerable explanation, that a man like him sending 8 minutes of protection and then following it personally was not an unremarkable thing, was in fact the kind of thing that told a story he had not yet consented to tell. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. The agreement sat between them, honest and unadorned, and Alina felt its weight, the way it confirmed rather than deflected, the way it refused the easy exit of a reasonable justification. He took off his coat. He laid it over the back of a chair with that same precise, habitual economy of gesture, and then he turned to face her fully, and the quality of his attention was the most complete thing she had ever been on the receiving end of, total, unwavering, like a light that illuminated without warmth, but without judgment either. "Tell me about the envelope," he said, "every detail, what it felt like, what the handwriting looked like, whether there was anything else," she told him. She was precise and thorough, because those were the things she was, and because she understood instinctively that precision was what he needed from her right now, not reassurance, not deference. Just facts delivered cleanly. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. "It was a warning," he said, "not a threat." "What's the difference?" she asked. He looked at her. "A threat tells you what they'll do. A warning tells you what they want you to do." He paused. "They want you to run." Alina held his gaze. "I don't run," she said. Something moved through his expression, brief and complex, a thing with several layers moving past at once. He looked at her for a long moment in a silence that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, just very full. Then he said, "No, I don't imagine you do." He stayed. That was the thing she hadn't expected, that he would stay, not just long enough to conduct his assessment and issue his instructions, but into the evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and a phone he checked occasionally, but did not appear to be urgently waiting on. She made tea because she needed something to do with her hands, and she sat across from him, and gradually, in the way that late evenings and strange circumstances occasionally produced, they talked. Not about the envelope, not about the shooting, not about the particular web of dangerous things that had apparently entangled her by virtue of a split-second decision 3 weeks ago. They talked the way 2 people talked when everything important was temporarily set aside, obliquely, carefully, finding the edges of each other through the things that were safe to say. He told her, without being asked, that he had grown up in Lyon, that his father had been a businessman of a certain kind, and that he had understood from a very young age what kind of businessman his father was, and that he had made a choice about what to do. With that understanding, he said this without apology and without elaboration, offered it the way he offered everything, as a fact to be received, not a story to be sympathized with. She asked him why he'd chosen this life rather than away from it. He was quiet for a moment. He turned the whiskey glass slowly between his hands, a small, uncharacteristic fidgeting that she suspected he was not fully aware of. "Because," he said finally, "running from something is not a choice. It's an absence of one." She thought about that. "Some people would say leaving is the harder thing," she said. "Some people," he said, "have never stayed." The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, the city pulsed with its indifferent nighttime rhythm, and in here there was the soft tick of an unfamiliar clock and the warmth of the light overhead and the strange suspended quality of a moment that felt like it existed outside the normal flow of things. "Can I ask you something?" Alina said. He inclined his head, very slightly. "The night of the shooting," she said, When you looked at me afterward, what were you thinking? The question arrived in the room and immediately changed its temperature. He stilled not the deliberate stillness of a man who was choosing how to respond, but the involuntary stillness of a man who had been caught off guard by something and was taking a fraction of a second longer than normal to recover. He looked at her across the table. The light was warm and the silence was complete, and his expression was doing something complicated, something that the usual architecture of his face was not quite managing to contain. I was thinking, he said very slowly, that in 38 years of my life, no one has ever done that. The words landed softly, but they landed deep, the way quiet things sometimes fell deeper than loud ones, the way a whisper could carry farther than a shout in the right kind of silence. Elena looked at him and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The statement did not invite response. It invited only the kind of witness that was given by sitting still and not looking away. And that was what she gave him. He looked back at her for 12 full seconds. Neither of them moved or spoke. The clock ticked. The city breathed outside the window. Something passed between them in that silence, not said, not acted on, just present, the way a door could be present without being opened. Then his phone lit up on the table, and he looked at it, and the moment closed like water over a stone. He spoke in short, clipped tones to whoever was on the other end. His face was shuttered and professional. He stood reaching for his coat, and Elena stood too. Not because she was following his cue, but because sitting felt suddenly wrong. Too small for whatever was happening in her chest. My men will be outside the door through the night, he said, sliding his phone into his pocket. There will be a car available if you need anything. Damien, she said. He stopped. She had not called him that before. Neither of them acknowledged this, but the name was there now, in the air between them, and there was no retrieving it. Thank you, she said, for coming yourself. He looked at her. His coat was in his hands. His expression was, she didn't have the word for it. Something between resolved and reluctant, as though he had arrived at a destination he had not been trying to reach and wasn't sure what to do now that he was there. Don't thank me, he said, and then quieter, it doesn't suit either of us. He left. She stood in the middle of the apartment for a long moment after the door closed, one hand pressed to the center of her chest, feeling her own heartbeat steady, deliberate, stubbornly present. The days that followed had a strange, compressed quality, as though time had decided to behave differently inside the walls of that 14th floor apartment, moving in ways that didn't correspond to how it moved outside. She worked. Maison Carré remained open, remained apparently untouched by the currents moving beneath it, and she went in for her shifts and moved through the dining room with her usual steadiness and served tables that were not his and pretended, adequately, that everything was ordinary. He came in on Thursday. He came in on Sunday. He sat at his usual table, and she served him, and they spoke in the clipped, careful codes they had developed, a language of omission and implication, of what was said by what wasn't said, and the other staff watched them with the kind of careful peripheral attention that people gave to things they understood were not their business but couldn't quite look away from. On the second Thursday, one of the kitchen staff, a young man named Marco who had a talent for being in the wrong place to hear the right things, told Elena very quietly, while they were both in the back corridor, that there was a rumor. She looked at him. About you, he said. He had the expression of someone who was uncertain whether they were helping or making things worse, and had decided that knowing was better than not knowing. And Mr. Carr, she kept her face neutral. What kind of rumor? Marco was quiet for a moment, turning a side towel in his hands. That he moved you out of your apartment, he said. That you're living somewhere he arranged. A pause. People are saying that the only reason you'd be kept that close is if you matter to him. He looked at her with something that was half concern, half the very human fascination with a story that appeared to be happening close enough to touch. Do you? Elena looked at him for a long moment. Outside the kitchen door, the soft sounds of the dining room continued their indifferent orchestration. I matter to the situation, she said carefully. That's different. Marco nodded slowly, as though this answered something, though she was not sure it answered the thing he'd actually asked. She went back to work, but the word matter followed her through the rest of the shift, sitting quietly in the back of her mind, asking the question that she was most determinedly not asking herself. The second note arrived on a Wednesday. Not at the safe house. They didn't know about the safe house, which was the only thing that allowed her to breathe with any regularity. This one arrived at Mason Carré itself, slipped beneath the staff entrance door sometime between the end of the lunch service and the beginning of the dinner shift. One of the kitchen staff found it and brought it to the manager, and the manager, understanding enough about the current situation to know that this was above his authority, brought it to Alina. She opened it at the kitchen counter, with everyone doing their absolute best to appear as though they were not watching. 2 words this time. You're next. Alina folded the note, folded it again, placed it in the pocket of her uniform with the same stillness she brought to everything, and went back to preparing the table settings for the evening service. Her hands did not shake, but her mind was already calculating, running the numbers, assessing the variables, arriving at the conclusion she had been delaying for 2 weeks now. The conclusion that the split-second decision she'd made in a dining room 1 month ago had not simply put her in the orbit of something dangerous. It had placed her at the center of it, and the center was not a place from which reasonable people simply walked away. He arrived at 8:30 that evening. She was at his table before his coat was off. There was a second note, she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it. At the restaurant this afternoon, he was still, completely, absolutely still in that way he had, as though stillness was a physical substance he could generate at will, filling all the space around himself with it. His eyes were on hers. She slid the folded note across the table. He picked it up. He opened it. He read it, and something happened in his face, something that moved through it fast and cold and deeply controlled, like a current beneath the surface of water that smooth water gave no sign of. He folded it again. He placed it in his jacket pocket. He looked at her. Sit down, he said. I'm working, she said. Alina. Her name this time, not Miss Vasquez. Just Alina, and the sound of it in his voice, stripped of the formal distance they had maintained between them, landed on her like something she hadn't braced for. Sit down, she sat. He leaned forward across the table minimally, just enough that the distance between them contracted from professional to something else, something without a clean category name. His voice dropped to something that was barely above silence. I need you to listen to me, he said, and I need you to hear what I'm actually saying, not just the words. She held his gaze and nodded once. This is no longer about proximity, he said. You are not in danger because you are near me. You are in danger because they have decided that you are significant. A pause, weighted and precise. Do you understand what I mean by significant? She looked at him. She did understand. The understanding arrived cold and clear, the way all the most important realizations arrived, not gradually but all at once, the picture assembling in a single moment of terrible clarity. They think I matter to you, she said. He held her gaze. He said nothing. And the silence that opened up in the space where a denial should have been was the loudest thing Alina Vasquez had ever heard. She didn't sleep that night either. She lay in the safe house bedroom with the city spread out beyond the window like a field of cold stars. And she stared at the ceiling, and she let the silence do what silence did when you stopped fighting it. She let it show her the things she had been carefully not looking at. She was significant. Not the word she would have chosen. Not the word that captured the particular texture of what had been building between them over these weeks. The careful exchanges, the loaded silences, the way he had come himself at 11 o'clock at night, the way he had said her name in a restaurant full of people, as though the formality between them had simply ceased to be something he was willing to maintain. Significant was a cold word, a strategic word, the kind of word a man like Damien Carr used when the word he actually meant was one he had not yet given himself permission to say. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. Her heart was beating steadily, stubbornly, the way it always did, the way she had always needed it to. She thought about her mother. She thought about the photograph on the bedside table, the one where her mother was laughing at something outside the frame, caught entirely off guard by joy, her head thrown back and her eyes crinkled shut, the kind of happiness that didn't know it was being watched. Her mother had loved with that same quality, openly, without strategy, without the protective architecture that Elena had spent years constructing around herself like a second skin. She had watched that love cost her mother everything, and she had decided, in the particular way that grief sometimes made decisions for you, that she would be smarter, that she would be more careful, that she would keep herself at a distance from anything that had the capacity to unmake her. She was not, she thought, doing a very good job of that. He came to the safe house the following morning. Not at night this time, not in the compressed drama of an emergency, but at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning with 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner that she hadn't known he knew she walked past every day when this had been a normal life. He set one on the kitchen table in front of her without comment. He sat down across from her. He was in a dark shirt rather than a suit jacket, and somehow this small deviation from his usual armor, felt more significant than anything that had yet happened between them. She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. "You know where I used to walk," she said. "I know a great many things about you, Elena." He said it simply, without apology, without the performance of casualness, as though the admission itself was a kind of offering. "Look, I have been paying attention. I have been paying attention in ways I did not tell you, and I am telling you now because the time for not telling you has passed." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. It was warm. She let it be warm against her palms. "How long?" she asked. "Since the night of the shooting." A pause. "I had you looked into. Standard procedure. Anyone who comes into contact with A." He stopped. Started again. "Anyone in proximity to my situation is assessed." And what did the assessment find? He looked at her across the table. "That you are exactly what you appear to be," he said, "which is rarer than you might think." She absorbed this. In the walking route, something moved in his expression, the ghost of something that was not quite discomfort, not quite self-awareness, but occupied the territory between them. "That was not the assessment," he said. "That was—" He stopped again. She waited. He picked up his coffee. He set it down without drinking from it. He looked at the table surface for a moment, an unusual gesture, for him, looking down rather than directly at the thing in front of him, and then he looked up and met her eyes with that total, undeflecting attention that she had come to understand was the most honest thing about him. "I wanted to know that you were safe," he said. In the mornings, before the day began, the kitchen was very quiet. Elena looked at him across the small table, across the 2 cups of coffee, across the weeks of careful distance and loaded silence and things neither of them had said. She looked at him and she felt something shift inside her, not dramatically, not with the sudden violence of something breaking, but with the slow, inexorable movement of something that had been held in place for a very long time, finally, quietly letting go. "Damien," she said. He looked at her. "Why did you really come yourself that night?" she asked, the truth, not the version with security arrangements in it. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer, might retreat behind the lacquered surface of himself and leave the question unanswered, the way he left so many things unanswered, preserved in their ambiguity like insects in amber. But he didn't, because, he said when you called, "I was across the city, and the thought of something happening to you before I could." He stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked at her with an expression that was doing something painful, the expression of a man watching a wall he built with his own hands begin to develop cracks, and understanding that he no longer has the materials to repair it. "I needed to be certain you were unharmed." She held his gaze. "You could have been certain from across the city," she said quietly. 8 men, 14 floors up. "You could have been certain without coming yourself." "Yes," he said. "I could have." The admission sat between them like something irretrievable. He looked at her steadily, and she looked back, and the silence was so full it had physical weight. You could have leaned against it, she thought. You could have rested your whole body against the weight of what was not being said, and it would have held you. It was Marco who broke the fragile equilibrium of those days. She had not been careful enough about what he saw. She understood that afterward had gone back through the preceding weeks cataloging the moments of visible evidence, the small accumulated betrayals of her own composure, the way she had stilled when his car pulled up outside, the way her hands had moved differently when she was heading to his table versus any other. Small things, the kind of things that only mattered if someone was paying attention with a specific intent. Marco was paying attention, not with malice. She believed that, even afterward believed that what he did out of a muddled, poorly considered combination of concern and self-interest, and the very human failure of not thinking through the consequences of information shared. He spoke to the wrong person. A man who ate lunch at Mason Carré 3 times a week and tipped generously and asked friendly questions and was, Alina now understood, employed by the people who had sent both of those notes. She found out on a Friday evening. One of Damien's men, the one she had mentally named Stone, for the quality of his face, came to find her between the lunch and dinner services. He brought her to a back room. He told her, in the economical way that all of Damien's men communicated, what had happened, what Marco had said, to whom. Alina sat very still when he finished. Does Damien know? She asked. Mr. Carr has been informed, yes. Where is Marco now? A pause, brief and significant, being spoken to, Stone said. She thought about Marco, his youth, his earnest face, the nervous way he'd turned the side towel in his hands when he'd told her about the rumor. He didn't understand what he was doing, she said. Stone looked at her with the careful blankness of someone who had been trained not to have opinions in front of people. That's for Mr. Carr to assess, he said. I'd like to speak to Damien. She said, I'd like to speak to him. She said again, and there was something in her voice, not loudness, not aggression, but a quality of absolute certainty that made Stone stop and look at her for a moment, and then nod once, slowly, and take out his phone. Damien arrived in 12 minutes. He came into the back room already knowing. She could tell by the compressed quality of his presence, the way the controlled surface of him was being asked to contain something larger than usual. He looked at her first, just for a moment. A sweep of his gaze from her face downward and back up. The rapid check of a man confirming that the thing he most needed to confirm is still intact. Then he looked at Stone. Give us the room, he said. Stone left, the door closed. Damien turned to face her fully. You've been told, he said. Yes, she stood. She looked at him directly. Marco didn't know what he was doing. He spoke to a man he should not have spoken to. He doesn't know this world. She said, he's 23 years old, and he works in a kitchen, and he was worried about me, and he made a terrible mistake. Those are not the same as a betrayal. Damien looked at her. His expression was doing that thing again, the thing where the controlled surface and something beneath it were moving in opposite directions, pulling against each other with a tension that expressed itself only in the finest details. The set of his jaw, the way his eyes were just slightly wider than usual. You're defending him, he said. I'm contextualizing him, she said. There's a difference, Alina. Whatever you're thinking about doing, she said, and her voice was steady and clear and entirely without performance. I'm asking you not to. The silence that followed was the kind that had texture, that pressed against the skin. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them moved. You don't know what I was thinking, he said. I know enough, she said. I know how your world operates. I know what happens when someone is considered a liability. She held his gaze and did not allow herself to blink or look away. He is 23 years old, and he made a mistake out of concern for someone he works with. That is not the same category. Something happened in Damien Carr's face that she had not seen before and would not forget. It was not anger. It was not the cold, compressed force of a man who had been challenged and was deciding how to respond. It was something that arrived behind his eyes and spread, very slowly, very quietly, into the rest of his expression. Something that looked, against all probability, like wonder. As though he was looking at something he had not expected to encounter. As though she had done it again, the thing she had done in the dining room 6 weeks ago, the thing his body still held the memory of, stepping into the path of something dangerous without flinching. Only this time the dangerous thing was him. He looked at her for a long time. Marco will be let go from his position, he said finally. He will receive 3 months' salary. He will not be a fractional pause, otherwise affected. Elena felt the breath leave her body in a slow, quiet release. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. I told you before, it doesn't suit either of us. But his voice when he said it was different from the first time he had said it. Softer, the words themselves the same, but underneath them, something had shifted in the frequency. Something that made them sound, this time, less like a deflection and more like an intimacy. She looked at him. He looked at her. The back room was small and close and lit by a single overhead light that cast everything in warm amber, and the city outside was indifferent and far away, and in here there were only the two of them and the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of things neither of them had said. She took one step toward him. Just one. He went absolutely still. She reached out and with 2 fingers lightly touched the cufflink on his left sleeve, adjusting it, though it didn't need adjusting. A gesture so small it barely registered as physical contact, and yet registered, in the particular silence of that room, as something enormous. She lowered her hand. She stepped back. We should go back, she said quietly. He said nothing. He looked at where her fingers had been. Then he looked at her face. Then he looked somewhere that wasn't either of those things, somewhere internal and unreachable. Yes, he said finally, we should. Neither of them moved for another 3 seconds. Then he turned. He reached for the door. He opened it with that same precise, economical gesture, and held it, and she walked through, and he followed, and they returned to the separate territories of their respective roles, and nobody watching would have seen anything unusual in their faces, or their bearing, or the distance they maintained between themselves as they moved through the restaurant. But Elena's 2 fingers were still warm, and Damien Carr's jaw was set with the particular tightness of a man who was applying significant internal force to the task of not thinking about something. It was Stone who told her, 3 days later, what had happened to the man who fired the shot. She hadn't asked. She had made a deliberate decision not to ask, on the grounds that some information was easier not to have, that there was a version of her life in which she could continue to function with selective ignorance of someone who understood the broad shape of a situation, without requiring all of its specific, irreversible details. Stone told her anyway. He found her on a Sunday morning at the safe house, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee and the particular quality of early light that made the city below look briefly, improbably, like something that had been designed with care. He told her in the same economical way he communicated everything cleanly without embellishment, the facts arranged in their correct order. The man who had fired the shot had been found. Elena kept her eyes on the city below, and, she said, he talked, Stone said, before the end. She absorbed this. The coffee cup was warm in her hands. The light was changing as the sun moved. That fleeting quality of early morning dissolving into ordinary day. What did he say? She asked, because she understood that Stone was here, telling her this for a reason. He said the order didn't come from a rival organization. Stone said it came from inside. She turned from the window. Stone's face was its usual carefully constructed blankness. But his eyes, she had learned to read his eyes in the weeks of living under his quiet protection, were doing something different. Something that looked like the specific weight of a man who is carrying information he wishes he didn't have. Inside meaning, she began, inside Mr. Carr's organization. Stone said, someone close. The kitchen went very quiet. Elena set her coffee cup down on the counter with a precision that had nothing to do with care for the cup, and everything to do with the fact that her hands needed something deliberate to do. She looked at Stone. Does Damien know? She asked. He will in approximately 20 minutes, Stone said. I came to you first because, he stopped, because, she said. Stone looked at her with that careful face. Because the name that was given, he said, is someone you have also met. The morning light came through the window, and lay across the kitchen floor in long, pale bars. The clock ticked on the wall. Elena stood very still and waited for the name, and when Stone said it, she felt the floor shift beneath her, not literally, not physically, but in that way that certain revelations made the ground of everything you'd understood rearrange itself without warning. The name was someone she had trusted. And the implications of that trust suddenly moved through everything, through every conversation, every moment she had thought was private, every carefully guarded thing she had let slip in. Belief that she was safe. I need to speak to Damien, she said. Her voice was completely steady. Now, she found him in the main room of the safe house. He was already there when Stone brought her through the door, standing at the window with his back to the room, his phone in his hand, his posture carrying the particular rigidity of a man who had just received information that had rearranged something fundamental and was in the process of deciding what to do with the rearrangement. He did not turn when she came in. He stood with his shoulders set and his spine straight, and the city behind the glass spread out below him like a kingdom that had just revealed a crack in its foundation. Stone closed the door behind her and left them alone. You know, she said. Yes. He still didn't turn. His voice was flat and controlled, and she could hear, beneath the flatness, something that was not flat at all, something that had velocity and heat and was being held at tremendous cost. She crossed the room and stood behind him, not touching him, close enough to speak quietly. Damien. He turned. She had prepared herself for his anger. She had imagined it on the walk through from the kitchen, the cold, compressed force of it. The way a man like him would process betrayal by contracting inward, by going colder, by building walls higher and faster than they could be broken down. She had braced for that. She knew how to stand in the face of cold. What she had not prepared for was this. His face was not cold. It was open, catastrophically, terrifyingly open, in a way that she had never seen it and understood, looking at it. She was never supposed to see. The controlled architecture of his expression had not contracted. It had simply fallen. Like scaffolding whose bolts had been removed simultaneously, all at once, leaving the raw structure beneath exposed to the air for the first time in longer than either of them could calculate. He looked like a man who had been hurt, not angered, not strategically inconvenienced. Hurt in the plain, human, devastating sense of the word. The kind of hurt that had nothing to do with power or position and everything to do with the terrible vulnerability of having trusted someone. Victor, he said. The name came out with a quality she had not heard in his voice before. Something abraded. Something that had been dragged across something sharp on its way out. 15 years. She said nothing. She stood and let him speak. He sat at my table. Damien said. He was in this room. He knew. He stopped. His jaw worked. He turned away again, briefly, and she watched his shoulders rise and fall with a breath that was slower and more deliberate than usual, the breath of a man manually overriding something. He knew everything. He was the one who arranged the additional security after the first shooting, which means he knew where the gaps were. Elena said quietly. Yes, the word arrived like something thrown against a wall. The room held the silence for a moment. The light was gray and even, the kind that belonged to overcast mornings, the kind that flattened everything and made the world look slightly more real than it did in softer light. In this light, with his face unguarded and his voice abraded and 15 years sitting in the air between them like smoke from something that was still burning, Damien Carr looked like what he was, and not what he performed, a man, just a man who had been loyal to someone who had not been loyal back, and was standing in the rubble of that discovery trying to find his footing. You trusted him, she said, not a judgment, a recognition. I don't trust people. He said, and the correction was automatic, reflexive, and they both heard how hollow it sounded, how thoroughly the last 5 minutes had retired that particular self-description. Damien, she said. He looked at her. You trusted him. She said again gently, insistently, that's not a weakness. That's not a failure. That's a don't, he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, she could tell, because the roughness surprised even him. She could see it in the fractional widening of his eyes. Don't manage me. I'm not managing you, she said. I'm telling you the truth. There's a difference. He looked at her. The rawness was still there, still visible, still uncontained, still doing the thing to his face that made her chest ache with the weight of witnessing it. You're very good at that, he said, at telling the truth, at finding the difference, he said, between things that looked the same from the outside. She held his gaze. The space between them was perhaps 3 feet, close enough for the texture of his breathing to be audible, close enough to see the precise quality of what was happening in his eyes. You've spent a long time with people who don't bother to look for the difference, she said. He said nothing. His jaw was tight. His eyes were on hers with an intensity that had gone beyond the deliberate. Beyond the strategic, this was something else, something unmanaged and direct. The gaze of a man who had run out of available barriers and was simply looking at the thing in front of him, without the usual protective infrastructure between them. 15 years, he said again, and this time it was quieter. This time it was something closer to grief. Elena did the thing that her body decided before her mind had a chance to intervene. She reached out and placed her hand against his jaw, not a grab, not a grip, just a resting of her palm against the angle of his face, steady and warm and entirely without hesitation. Her thumb was perhaps half an inch from the small scar on his jaw that had never fully healed from the night of the shooting. His skin was warm. His jaw was rigid under her hand, clenched with the sustained effort of holding everything in. He went absolutely still. He did not pull away. He closed his eyes. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds, 4 seconds in which neither of them breathed properly, in which the room contracted to the size of the space directly between them, in which something that had been building for 6 weeks arrived at its fullest expression in the simple, devastating fact of her palm against his face, and his eyes closed against whatever he was feeling. Then he opened his eyes. He looked at her with an expression that she felt in her sternum like a struck chord, low and resonant and reverberating somewhere deep. And he said very quietly, Elena. Just her name, only her name. But the way he said it this time was nothing like the controlled, measured deployment of syllables she had come to know. This time it came out like something released, like something that had been held underwater and had finally, inevitably, surfaced. She lowered her hand. She did not step back. I need to tell you something, he said. His voice had changed. The flatness was gone, not replaced by warmth exactly, but by something more honest than flatness. Something that acknowledged the existence of an interior life in a way his voice rarely did. Tell me, she said. He turned away from her. He moved to the kitchen table and sat down, not in the controlled, deliberate way he usually sat, but in the way a person sat when their legs had simply had enough of holding them up. He put his forearms on the table. He looked at his hands for a moment. She sat across from him. Victor came to me 12 years ago, he said. He had nothing. He had debts and a damaged reputation and a particular set of skills that were going to get him killed if he didn't find someone to redirect them towards something purposeful. He paused. I gave him that. I gave him structure, protection, a place, another pause, longer. A family, in the sense that the word can be applied to the kind of life I lead. Elena listened. She did not move or speak. She understood that he needed the silence to carry his words without interruption. There was a woman, he said. The sentence arrived and changed the quality of the air immediately, the way certain sentences did, arriving loaded with the weight of what they were about to open. 3 years ago, her name was Isabel. She was not part of my world. She was a musician. She played piano at a concert hall on the east side. He looked at his hands. She was the kind of person who had never learned to be afraid of things that deserved to be feared. She laughed very easily. She argued with me about things that no one else would have thought to argue about. Elena kept her face still. Victor knew about her. Damien said. He was one of 3 people who knew. I kept her outside everything, protected, I thought. His jaw tightened. She died 14 months ago, a car accident, we were told. It was investigated, he stopped. I accepted the conclusion, because the alternative was. He stopped again. Elena watched his face. Victor's testimony. he said slowly, as though placing each word with care, includes Isabel. The room went completely silent. Elena felt the full weight of what he had just said arrive in her chest and settle there, heavy, cold, devastating. She looked at him across the table, and she saw in his face the thing that men like him were not supposed to have, the thing that made them human against all the architectural efforts to the contrary. He had loved someone, he had lost her, and the man he had trusted most had been responsible for both. "Damien," she said, and her voice came out lower than she intended, thickened with something she was not going to call what it was. He looked up at her, his eyes were dry. She thought they would stay dry, thought he had enough control for that whatever was happening inside him would be contained to the inside. And then she looked at him more carefully, in the gray, even light of that overcast morning, and she saw that she was wrong. Not tears, not quite. But the quality of his eyes had changed. Something behind them was wet and held back and enormous. The way a river was enormous behind a dam, the sheer contained force of it, the pressure of all that water against all that stone. She had told herself she would not cry. She had told herself it months ago, in the abstract, that she would not be the kind of person who cried in front of Damien Carr, that she would maintain the dignity of her own separate emotional landscape regardless of what proximity to him produced. She was failing at that. She could feel the pressure behind her own eyes, the familiar gathering that came when something hit the exact frequency of her own grief, the place where her mother lived, the place where loss had made its permanent residence inside her. She pressed her lips together, she breathed, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. She felt his fingers tense, a brief, involuntary contraction, and then, slowly, with the quality of something immense and effortful, he turned his hand over beneath hers and held it. His grip was careful, not tight, the careful grip of a man who was aware of his own strength and was choosing, consciously, to moderate it, to hold something without crushing it, to make contact without demanding it, to be present in the space of another person's palm without insisting on anything beyond the presence itself. They sat like that for a long time. Clock on the wall ticked, the gray light held steady. The city below moved through its indifferent morning, entirely unaware that 14 floors up, in a safe house that smelled of cedar and coffee, 2 people were sitting at a kitchen table with their hands joined, not speaking, each one breathing through something enormous that neither had the words for yet. This was the moment that Elena Vasquez would return to later. Not the drama of the shooting, not the notes, not the escalating danger. This, the table, the gray light. His hand turned over beneath hers, and the careful quality of his grip, and the shared silence of 2 people who had each been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and who were just for this moment, just in this room, not carrying it entirely alone. The door opened, stone. His face wore the expression it always wore, careful blankness, the cultivated neutrality of someone who had learned to witness many things without reacting. But his eyes went to their joined hands on the table, and he looked away immediately, and the professionalism with which he pretended he had not seen it was the most obvious thing in the room. "Sir," he said, "they've located Victor." Damien did not move immediately. This was the remarkable thing, that a man whose world had just pivoted on a critical axis, whose every operational instinct should have had him on his feet and moving before the sentence was complete, sat for 1 more second with his hand over Elena's. 1 second, then he stood, his face closed. Not completely, not the way it used to close, that total architectural lockdown. Every door bolted and every window shuttered. It closed partially, the way a room closed when someone turned off only some of the lights. Some things still visible. Some doors still fractionally ajar. Where, he said, Stone told him, a location, an address, a time frame. Damien listened with the focused, rapid attention of a man shifting into a mode Elena had not seen him in before, operational, precise, every calculation running at speed. He reached for his jacket. He put it on. He looked at her. She stood. She faced him across the kitchen table. She held his gaze with the same steadiness she had always brought to the space between them, and she did not ask him to be careful, and she did not reach for him, and she did not say any of things that the moment seemed to call for, because she understood that he needed her to be exactly what she had always been. Steady, unfrightened, the thing that did not require managing. "Stay here," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he said very quietly something that was barely above a breath. "When I come back," he stopped. She waited. He shook his head, a small, tight movement. The movement of a man choosing not to complete a sentence, because the sentence was not yet safe to finish. "When I come back," he said again, and left it there, an unfinished thing, a door not opened, but not locked either. He turned, he walked to the door. Stone followed. The door closed. Elena stood in the kitchen with the gray light around her, and the clock ticking, and the warmth of his hand still registered against her palm. And she breathed in and out, slow and deliberate, way her mother had taught her. And she waited. He was gone for 4 hours and 17 minutes. She knew because she counted. She had nothing else to do, and counting gave her the same thing it had always given her, a rhythm, a structure, a small proof that time was still moving even when everything else felt suspended in the particular amber of waiting. She had spent a great deal of her life waiting. She was good at it. She had learned to inhabit it rather than fight it, to move through the hours with the same deliberate presence she brought to everything. Rather than flattening herself against the minutes as they passed, she made tea. She drank it standing at the window, watching the city below conduct its afternoon business with the cheerful indifference of a world that did not know or care what was happening 14 floors above it. She opened her blue notebook and sat at the kitchen table and wrote for a while, not about any of this, not about him, not about the weight of his hand over hers or the abraded quality of his voice. When he'd said 15 years or the way, his eyes had looked in the gray morning light, when he'd spoken Isabel's name. She wrote about her mother. She wrote about a specific afternoon from her childhood, a Sunday, summer, the smell of something cooking. Her mother humming something tuneless and cheerful, while Elena sat at the kitchen table, doing homework she didn't understand. And the particular quality of safety that had lived in that afternoon like light, lived in amber. Preserved, permanent in its way, accessible still, if she reached for it carefully. She wrote until the light outside the window began to change, the flat gray of the morning softening toward the warmer tones of late afternoon. And then she closed the notebook and held it in her lap and let herself, quietly and without drama, feel the fear that she had been managing all day, not fear for herself. She had made a kind of peace with her own position in this. Had accepted, somewhere in the weeks of notes and safe house nights and loaded silences, that she was in it now, fully and irreversibly, and that acceptance had brought with it a strange, grounded calm. The fear she felt now was different in its object. Directional, pointed at a specific person, moving through a dangerous afternoon, somewhere in the city below. She pressed her hand flat against the cover of the notebook. She breathed. She told herself he was capable. She told herself he had been navigating this world for longer than she had known him, that he had resources and men and the particular intelligence of someone who had survived by understanding every room he walked into before he entered it. She told herself all of this. She then acknowledged, privately and without flinching, that none of it made the waiting easier. She heard the door at 6:43, one set of footsteps, the quality she recognized, that precise, economical cadence, that particular weight. She was standing in the kitchen doorway when he came into the main room, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him the first night he had come to this apartment. Rapidly, thoroughly, involuntary assessment of someone checking for damage. He was unhurt, physically intact. His jacket was gone, and his shirt had been rolled to the elbows, and there was a tiredness in his face that went beyond the physical, the specific exhaustion of a day that had required more than the body that had taken something from the deeper reserves. He stopped when he saw her. They looked at each other across the room. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The apartment was warm and quiet around them, the evening light coming through the windows in long horizontal bars. And in that light, with the distance between them and the day sitting heavily in the air, she thought he looked like the most human she had ever seen him. "It's done," he said. 2 words. She understood everything they contained, the resolution of a betrayal, the closing of a chapter that had cost more than its operational dimensions suggested, the particular weight of an ending. That was also a loss even when it was a necessary one. 15 years. Whatever Victor had been and whatever he had done, he had been 15 years of something. And the ending of 15 years of anything left a mark, regardless of what it deserved. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked at her. The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, not its fact, but its direction, the way it was aimed entirely at him and not at the situation, not at the operational outcome, not at the security implications, just at him. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the most honest answer he had ever given her. More honest even than the admission about the walking route, more honest than the unfinished sentence. Because "I don't know yet" required the acknowledgement of an interior landscape that was still being assessed, still in process, still feeling its own dimensions, and a man who claimed to have no interior landscape did not say "I don't know yet." He said fine, he said resolved, he said it's handled and moved on. Damien Carr said "I don't know yet," and looked at her while he said it as though she were the person he had come back to tell. She crossed the room. She didn't rush. She moved the way she moved through everything with deliberateness, with presence without performance. She stopped in front of him, and she looked up at him in the warm evening light, and she said quietly, "You came back. I said I would," he said. "You didn't say that," she said. "You said, when I come back. You didn't say I will." Something moved through his expression, the ghost of something that lived in the same country as amusement. The same fractional shift at the corner of his mouth she had seen that very first evening at his table, only this time it didn't come and go in an instant. This time it arrived and it stayed, small, contained, but present. Undeniably, remarkably present. "When I come back," he said, and his voice was low and close, and the unfinished sentence was back between them. And this time he did not stop at the comma. "I want to finish what I didn't say this morning." She held his gaze, then "Finish it," she said. He looked at her. The evening light moved across his face. His expression was doing the thing it did now in her presence. That partial opening, those few remaining unlocked doors, the version of him that existed only in this specific space between himself and her, and had not existed, she suspected, for a very long time. "I don't know how to do this," he said. The words came out with a directness that cost him something. She could hear the cost in the quality of his voice, the way it was stripped of the usual precision, left plain and unadorned. "I don't have a reference for it. I have spent a very long time constructing a life in which this," he paused, "in which this was not a variable." She looked at him steadily. "And now," she said, "and now?" He said, "You stepped in front of a bullet that was meant for me, and you argued for a kitchen boy's life with the same conviction you would have brought to your own. And you put your hand on my face this morning, and he stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked at her with an expression that was entirely without the protective infrastructure she had first encountered across a white tablecloth, that had nothing left of the cold remove. "I have been thinking about nothing else all day." The room was very quiet. Alina felt the words settle into her, not with the violence of surprise, but with the deep, resonant recognition of something she had known was coming, and had been both waiting for and quietly afraid of. She felt them in her chest, in the place where her mother lived, in the place where she had been carefully not feeling things for the better part of 6 weeks. "Damien," she said, "I know," he said, "I know what I am. I know what this life is. I'm not asking you to." He stopped. "Start it again. I'm not asking you for anything that requires you to pretend any of that is different from what it is. I know what you are," she said. "I've known for 11 months. I stayed." He looked at her. "I stayed," she said again quietly, "and it wasn't for the money." The silence that followed was the purest one they had yet shared, not loaded, not weaponized, not full of unspoken things fighting to be acknowledged. Just clean and open and full of something that had finally, after all these weeks of careful management, been allowed to exist in the air between them without apology. He reached out. His hand, the one she had read over these weeks, the one that gripped a whiskey glass too carefully and turned a phone without purpose, and had turned itself over beneath hers at the kitchen table, reached out and touched her face, his thumb traced very lightly, the line of her cheekbone. The touch was so careful it barely registered as pressure. The touch of a man who was aware he was handling something he did not want to damage. She leaned into it. Just slightly, just enough. His forehead came down to rest against hers. They stood like that, foreheads together, his hand against her face, her hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, steady, deliberate, stubbornly present, not so different from her own. And the evening light held them, and the city moved below, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed saying that words were the right instrument for. Later, much later, when the evening had deepened into night and the city below had shifted into its darker, quieter register, she sat at the kitchen table with her tea, and he sat across from her. With his whiskey and the silence between them was the most comfortable silence she had yet experienced in his presence. Not charged, not loaded, just inhabited, the silence of two people who had arrived, by a route neither of them would have chosen, at a place they had not known they were heading. He was watching her with an expression she was still learning to read, still finding all the rooms of, still mapping the interior. She suspected it would take a long time. She suspected she did not mind that. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. He looked at her, waited, "The night of the shooting," she said, "when I stepped in front of you." She held her tea in both hands and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at him. "I told you I didn't know why, that it happened before I could think. I remember," he said. "That was true," she said. "But it wasn't the whole truth." She paused, in the half-second between hearing the shot and understanding what it meant. "I saw someone else's face, not yours." She paused again. "My mother's, the way she looked the last time I saw her in the hospital, the way she looked at me like she was trying to memorize my face before." She stopped. Breathed. "She died alone because I was 20 minutes too late. I was 20 minutes too late, and I have never," she pressed her lips together, "I have never stopped being 20 minutes too late." The kitchen was completely silent, so when I heard that shot, she said, "Something in me just refused to be too late again. Refused to let it happen to someone else while I was standing close enough to do something." She looked at him. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't heroism. It was just, I couldn't be too late again. Damien Carr looked at her across the kitchen table. He looked at her for a long, long moment, and then he said very quietly, something that she had not expected from him, something that arrived so softly and so directly that it bypassed every defense she had and landed in the exact place she had been protecting most carefully. "You weren't too late," he said. "You were exactly on time for all of it." She felt the tears arrive before she could stop them, not the managed, ration version she had been permitting herself in careful 60-second increments, but the real kind, the kind that came from below all the management, from the place where her mother lived and her grief lived, and all the things she had been carrying alone for 4 years. She didn't perform them, and she didn't fight them. She let them come 2, 3, silent, and she let him see them. He reached across the table. He placed his hand over hers. He didn't say anything else. He simply held her hand in the warm light of the kitchen and let the silence do what silence did when two people had finally stopped filling it with everything except the truth. Let it hold them. Let it be enough. Let it be the thing that it was. She was still crying when she laughed, a small, surprised sound, the kind that arrived when emotion became too large for any single register and spilled across into another. "I stepped in front of a bullet," she said, "and somehow this is the more frightening thing." He looked at her with that expression she was still learning, and she saw it again, more clearly than she had ever seen it. That fractional shift at the corner of his mouth, that ghost of something that lived in the same country as warmth. This time it didn't come and go. This time, for the first time, it stayed. 3 weeks later, she moved back into her apartment. The threat had been neutralized, Victor's network dismantled, the danger receding from its acute peak into something more manageable, more distant. Stone drove her. He carried her bag to the door with the same careful professionalism he brought to everything, and when she thanked him, he nodded in that single, precise way of his and turned to leave. Then he stopped. He looked at her over his shoulder. And he said, entirely without precedent, in a voice that suggested this was not a thing he did often, possibly ever, "He checks the walking route every morning." Still, he left before she could respond. She stood in the doorway of her apartment, her things, the careful and deliberate arrangement of a life she had built from very little. And she pressed her hand flat against the door frame and breathed and thought about that every morning. She went inside. She unpacked her single bag with the same deliberate care she had packed it. She placed her mother's photograph back on the nightstand, and the one where her mother was laughing at something outside the frame, caught entirely off guard by joy. She looked at it for a long moment. "I know," she said quietly, to the photograph, to the room, to the version of her mother that lived in the place inside her where grief and gratitude existed together in the complicated piece of long, carried, "I know." She made tea. She stood at her own kitchen window with her own view, smaller than the safe house view, humbler, more familiar, more hers, and she watched her street in the early morning light. Her phone vibrated on the counter. A message. No greeting, no preamble, no signature, because he was a man who did not explain himself and did not perform, and had never found superfluous words to be worth the breath they required. 3 words, "Are you home?" She looked at the message for a moment. She looked out the window at her street, the ordinary, unheroic, entirely beloved street that she had walked every morning for 11 months, apparently not alone. She typed back, 2 words, "Come up." She set the phone down on the counter. She smoothed the front of her shirt. She looked around her apartment, her things, her life, the careful construction of a woman who had learned to need very little and had, somehow, without fully consenting to it, arrived at wanting something more. She breathed, she waited, and downstairs, somewhere in the ordinary morning of the street below, she heard a car door close. Some doors once opened cannot be closed again. And some people, once seen, truly seen, in the gray morning light with all the walls down and all the careful distance finally, irreversibly dissolved, cannot be unseen. She knew this. She had always known this. It was why she had been so careful. She had not been careful enough. She did not, standing in her kitchen in the early morning light, with her tea in her hands and her heart doing something steady and terrifying and entirely new, think that was the wrong outcome. The knock came. She crossed the room. She opened the door.